Alright guys, hello and welcome to today's lesson. This is Mr. Ludden, and today we're going to be having a look at using the quadratic formula and how it comes up in exams and how to dodge the common mistakes that some students make using the quadratic formula. In summary, the quadratic formula gets you the roots of your quadratic equation without actually having to draw on a graph. So if you remember, the roots of your graph would have been where your graph crosses the x-axis. I'll put a link to my video on functions below in the description if you need a refresher on that. That might be a good place to start before you have a look at this video. Also, another video that really ties in with the quadratic formula is my one on factorizing quadratic equations using the guide number method. I'm going to put a link to that in my description, and that's also where we're going to start today. So just before we have a look anywhere near the quadratic formula, we'll just factorize and solve this quadratic equation using the guide number method, and then I'll link it into our quadratic formula and the benefits of using the quadratic formula over your guide number method. So factorizing and solving this, 2x squared plus 15x plus 7, it's a quadratic, so I'm going to use my guide number method. My guide number is going to be 2 multiplied by 7. So my 2 was the number before my x squared, the 7 was the number at the end, or the number the constant, the number without an x attached to it. So 2 times 7 will give me 14, and I write out my factors of 14, which is 14 and 1, minus 14 and minus 1, 2 and 7, and minus 2 and minus 7. And as we can see, the only pair of factors that will give me my plus 15x in the middle is my 1 and my 14. So what I'm going to do underneath here is I'm going to say, well, 2x squared plus 7, so just keep those two, they're not changing, but I am replacing my 15x in the middle with my 14x plus 1x. So I'm going to have plus 14x plus 1x. Now as you can see, we haven't changed the value of my quadratic up here. We've just changed the way it looks so that we can factorize this using grouping. Now you'll notice that there's an equal 0 at the end. I'm going to talk about that in my very last step. So we're just going to keep that with us all the way, and I'll deal with that in a couple of minutes. So what we have now is a grouping question. I'm going to split those up. So the highest common factor between 2x squared and 14x is 2x. And in my brackets, I'm going to have x plus 7. On this side, my highest common factor is 1. In my brackets, I'm going to have x plus 7. I'm going to have equals 0. We notice that I have an x plus 7 here and an x plus 7 here. It's the highest common factor between those two terms, so I'm going to take that out. X plus 7. The things left over are my 2x and my plus 1. So in my brackets here, I'm going to have 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. Excuse me. Okay, so if your question just asked you to factorize a quadratic, you'd be done at this step here. Your x plus 7 multiplied by your 2x plus 1. You factorized your 2x squared plus 15x plus 7. However, it tells us to factorize and solve, and that's where the equals 0 comes in. Seeing as there's an equals here, it means that we should have at the very end, we should have like x is equal to something at the very end. That's what the solve actually means. It means to get x on its own. Now we have 2 more steps to do before we go from factorizing to solving. And just before we make that step, I'm just going to do a small bit of rough work over here to explain my next step. If you had some number multiplied by another and it was equal to 0, the best way about going about this would be to try and find out is there anything that we can say about the number that goes in this box and the number that goes in this box. So to explain what's going on, I'm just going to say, well, if I put 3 in this box, what would have to go in my other box? And I'm hoping that you're thinking of the number 0. So 3 times 0 will give me 0. Perfect. If I put 13 in this box, the 0 has to stay there. 13 times 0 will give me 0. In fact, it doesn't matter what I put in this box. The 0 has to go in my other box for this equation to make sense. So even if I put 27 billion here, I'd still have to multiply it by 0 to get 0. There's no other number that I could multiply that by to get 0. And the same works the other way around. If I had, let's say, 7 in this box here, I'd have to multiply it by 0 to get 0. So let's say if I had a in this box and B in this box, and I was multiplying them together to get 0. Well, you can say something straight away about either A or B using what we just talked about. You can say that, well, either A has to be 0 for this to make sense, or another scenario, my B has to equal to 0. There's no other numbers, like either A or B has to be 0. If none of these are 0, then you cannot get 0 as your answer over here. So I hope that makes sense. Over on my left hand side here, and I'll just get my highlighter. Over here, we've got the same scenario. We've got, except a few more variables, or a few more terms even, I suppose. We've got x plus 7 multiplied by 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. So we know from what we've said before, we know that either my x plus 7 has to be 0, for this to make sense, either x plus 7 has to be 0, or my 2x plus 1 has to be equal to 0. So it's the exact same thing as I've done over here. My first thing has to be 0, or my second thing has to be 0 in order for the whole thing to be true. Then what you're left to do is just solve what you're left over with. So x plus 7 is equal to 0. If I take 7 away from both sides, I'm going to be left with x is equal to minus 7. And on my other side, if I take 1 away from both sides to isolate the x on its own, I'm going to end up with 2x is equal to minus 1. And if I divide both sides by 2, I'm going to end up with x is equal to minus a half. And I just about had enough room there. So x is equal to minus 7 or x is equal to minus a half is your answer. You've got two answers for this equation up here. So what you're actually saying is that if I substitute minus 7 in for x in my original equation, then I will get 0 as my answer. But I'll also get 0 if I substitute in minus a half. So very quickly, if I was to draw a sketch of this graph here, and I'm going to do it here where I just have a small bit of space, my graph would cross the x-axis at minus a half, which would be somewhere around here, minus a half, and it would also cross it at minus 7, and minus 7 would be up here somewhere. So I know that those are 2 points on my graph. There's also more things that you can say about this graph just by looking at this here, but I've covered that in my functions video, so I'm not going to go into that here. We need to find out how this relates to our quadratic formula. So for my quadratic formula, it takes us right from our first point here to our last point without factorizing, and there's certain places where you use it specifically, and we're going to have a look at those by looking at exam questions in 1 minute. Before we do that, we're going to have a look at what the log tables say and what your quadratic formula actually looks like. So on page 20 of your log tables, it looks like this, and the only thing there that you actually need for your junior cert is the top formula. So I'm just going to get my highlighter. This right here is your quadratic formula, and it's a good idea to learn it because it'll save you a bit of time in your exam. But if you forget it, or if you're not sure, or if you want to just reference it, it's on page 20 in your log tables. So that's it there, and it tells you that this will give you the roots of your quadratic equation when your quadratic equation looks like this, when it looks like ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. Now you might be thinking, oh, like, where did your a, your b, your c come from? What's the x doing? Where's your square root coming from? Like, what's going on here? You've just thrown this at us. I think the best way that I can explain what's going on here is with an example. You don't have to know where this formula comes from, but I will put a link to it in the description because it is quite interesting. There's a small bit of algebra to it. If you were interested to see where this actually comes from, your quadratic equation, as I said, I will put the link in the description. But it's not asked, you're not asked like, oh, where does this come from in your junior cert? You're just asked to learn where and when to use it and to be able to use it correctly. So enough of me talking. We're going to go straight to 2017 question 9, and your question asked you to solve the equation x squared minus 2x minus 4 is equal to 0. And then it asks you to give your answers in the form a plus or minus root b, where a and b are elements of n. So we're just going to concentrate on this just for a minute. Your answer should look like a plus or minus root b. And we'll have a look in a minute. That's a real telltale sign that you should use your quadratic formula. Because right up there in your quadratic formula, I'll just get rid of that, right there, the plus or minus, there, you haven't seen a plus or a minus come together. And we will be talking about that in a minute. But that's the only place in maths that you've ever seen a plus or a minus come together like that. And in your question here, they say that your answer should look like a plus or minus root b. So this is a telltale sign that you should use your quadratic formula. So we need to know, for using our quadratic formula, we need to know in here, well, what's a, what's b, and what's c. And for that, we're going to use, again, this part here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write out this bit here in my actual question. The ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So draw, I want to use my navy pen. There we go. Okay, so ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. Now the quadratic that you're given is this thing here. So I'm going to write that just underneath it. I'm going to say x squared minus 2x minus 4 is equal to 0. Now if we just look at the x squared here, the number before that, there is no number before that, but if we were to put one in, we put in the number 1. The coefficient 1 sometimes isn't put in, oftentimes it's not put in. Like if you had x is equal to 3, that's the same thing as saying 1x is equal to 3, but oftentimes we don't put in the 1x. It means the exact same thing, but I suppose x is just a handier way of writing that. For this question here, I'm going to put the 1 in because it's going to help me find out what my a is. If we were to combine our two quadratic equations, we'd see that the a, the thing in front of my x squared, is going to be 1. We would see that, I'll try and use a different highlighter, the b here, plus b, is going to be the thing in front of my x, which is going to be minus 2. And you might be able to guess what c is just by looking at that. I'm going to go orange. My c is going to be minus 4. So I've just compared the quadratic that I'm actually given, my x squared minus 2x minus 4 is equal to 0. And I've compared it to the quadratic in the log tables over here. So I'm just going to write that out just a small bit neater, just so you can see exactly what's happening. I know that a is equal to 1. I know that b is equal to minus 2. And I know that c is equal to minus 4. Once you have those three things, all you have to do is substitute it into your formula and tidy it up. Just forgetting a, b, and c, forgetting those, just be careful that your b is minus 2 and your c is minus 4. That minus there belongs to the 4, that minus there belongs to the 2. If you were to put in 2 and 4 there, you will end up with the wrong answer and you lose quite a lot of marks just for something silly. So try not to do that. There was one other thing I was going to say. It'll come back to me. Okay, so we're going to substitute in our a, b, and our c into my formula. So my formula is minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. X is equal to. Okay, so I'm going to substitute in my three values, my a, b, and my c, into my formula here. And I've just remembered what I was going to say about, or just a couple of seconds ago. Your a is going to be 1. It's not going to be 1x squared. So you never bring your x squared down in here. Your a is just the number in front of your x squared. Your b is just a number in front of the x. And your c is just the number on its own. You don't bring your x down with those. If you do, you'll end up with x's in here, and it's going to be a disaster. So it's just the number in front of your x squared, your x, and your number at the end that corresponds to your a, your b, and your c. So just be careful of that. Okay, so I'm going to have x is equal to minus b. Now the first minus here is part of the formula, and my b is minus 2. So seeing as I have a minus and a minus coming together, I'm just going to protect those with brackets, and when I start tidying that up, I'll address that. So the first minus here was from the formula. That minus 2 is the b. I've got plus or minus the square root of b squared, so it's going to be minus 2 squared minus 4. A was 1 and my c was minus 4. All over, so everything over 2a. So 2 times a, 2 times 1. There's my brackets again. Okay, on that line there, all I've done is I've taken out the a, b, and c and put in what they were equal to, and I've protected those with brackets just to help myself out. Now I'm going to go on to my next page and I'm going to solve this out. So on the top I've got x is equal to minus 2. So that's going to simplify to x is equal to a minus times a minus is a plus. That's going to be plus 2. I have my plus or my minus square root of the square root of minus 2 squared. Well, minus 2 squared is positive 4 because minus 2 times minus 2 is 4. Then here I'm going to have minus 4 times 1, which is minus 4, and minus 4 times minus 4, which will give me 16. All over 2 times 1, which is 2. Now, if I was to simplify that down, it'd be x plus or minus root 20 all over 2. Your 20 is coming from 4 plus 16. Alright, from here, if you put this into your calculator, you're going to get x is equal to 1 plus or minus root 5. And I'm going to show you this in a future video on surds. Right now, getting from here to here, no, I was going to write down surds. I'm not going to write down that. Your calculator will do that for you. If I start talking about how to get from here to here without using your calculator, it's going to add about maybe 10 minutes onto the video if I was to do it correctly. So right now we're just worried about getting down here. Using your calculator is fine, getting from here to here. But I will be addressing that in a future video on surds. If you wanted to look up surds in the meantime, be my guest. So right now, if we look at the question asks us to give our answers in the form a plus or minus root b, and we've done that. But you might be asking, well, what's the story with the plus or minus? Like, what does that actually mean? And in order to answer that, I'm going to go up to the first question that we had answered today, and it was this one. And if you think about it, at the end here, we had x equal to minus 7, x is equal to minus a half. So you actually had two answers at the bottom. This here is actually two answers combined into one. It's your formula's way of telling you that there are two answers. So in much the same way that up here, I had x equal to minus 7 or x is equal to minus 2. For this question here, I have x is equal to 1 plus root 5 or x equals 1 minus root 5. So I actually have two answers. Now for your question, it actually didn't ask for that. Like, stopping here was absolutely fine. And they actually wanted you to do that because they wanted you to leave your answer as a plus or minus root b. But just in case they ask you to leave your answers in, like, give me two answers, I've just shown you that step there. If we were to look at the American scheme, that's what the American scheme looks like. So just one or two things to point out. If we have a look at the marks given out, you're either getting 0, 5, 7 or 10, and they've sort of broken it up into three steps. Your first step is identifying A, B or C. So that's just matching up like the A, the B and the C in your quadratic. So it's what we did in our first step up here. So step number 1. So if you tell me that A is equal to 1, B is equal to minus 2 and C is equal to minus 4, you're getting your 5 marks there. And not only that, even if you give me only one of those, so if you say that A is equal to 1, or B is equal to -2, or C is equal to -4, just one of those, you're getting your 5 marks. So they're giving away half marks for literally pointing out what your A, B, and C are, which is probably the easiest 5 marks you'll get in the whole question. To get your next 5 marks, you need to substitute in and tidy up your formula properly. So just be careful if your minus sign's there. Last thing I'm going to talk about is they're going to take 1 mark away from you if you don't put your answer in the way that they want it. So like this. If you put that into your calculator, and if you said like 1 plus root 5 and you got your answer, and then you said 1 minus root 5 and you got your answer, and you put it in decimal form, these two here would be your answers. You would have x is equal to minus 1.236, or x is equal to 3.236. If you put it like that, your answer, you're losing 1 mark because you haven't put the answer in the way that they wanted to in the question. And just to go back to the question, this bit up here, A plus or minus root B. So it'd be an awful shame to do all that hard work and then lose a mark at the end just by not reading the question. So just be careful of that. A similar question came up in 2015. It was question 9b on your paper 1. Solve the equation 2x squared minus 7x minus 10 is equal to 0. So again, it says solve, so you need to find x at the end. So that's like clue number 1 that you're using your quadratic equation. And also your next line here is a dead giveaway. It says give each answer corrected 2 decimal places. You know that your answer isn't going to be nice because it's going to, you have to round it to 2 decimal places. So if your answer isn't going to be nice, that means chances are you're not going to be able to use your guide number method in order to get your roots off your quadratic equation. It means you're going to have to use your quadratic formula. So 2 clues there in the question. Solve, the word solve, it means you need to get your x at the bottom, and the fact that it's asked you to 2 decimal places means that your quadratic formula is perfect for this. And I suppose the thing we should have looked at the very, very start, is this a quadratic? It has an x squared part, it has an x part, it has a number at the end. Yes, of course it is. So I'm going to do this a small bit quicker than my other one. First of all, I'm going to find out what A, what B, and what C are. So A is 2, B is minus 7, and C is minus 10. My quadratic formula says that x is equal to minus b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if I was to substitute those in, x is equal to minus b, so x is equal to minus 7 plus or minus 7 squared minus 4. My a was 2 and my c was minus 10 all over 2a, 2 times 2. So on my top line, I'm going to have x is equal to minus times a minus is going to give me plus 7. And I don't want to add title, don't want to add text. Okay, so what was I saying? X is equal to minus times a minus 7. X is equal to 7 plus or minus, square root of minus 7 squared. Square root minus 7 squared is minus 7 times minus 7, which will give me 49. I'm going to have, on this side, I'm going to have minus 4 times 2. Minus 4 times 2, which is minus 8. Minus 8 times minus 10, which would give me a plus 80. And all over 2 times 2, which is 4. Just on this step here, you can put all that into your calculator if you want to, but I would advise against it just on the fact that there's so much going on here, and you've got minus signs, you've got squares, you've got brackets. It's an absolute minefield. If you make one mistake on your calculator, then you're leaving yourself open to losing quite a lot of marks. What I would do is I would get down as far as here first, and then I would start putting things into my calculator. So I'm going to end up with x is equal to 7 plus or minus 49 plus 80 is 129 all over 4. And here, if we look back to our question here asked us to do decimal places, so we need to go to our calculator. So we're going to have either x is equal to 7 plus root 129 all over 4, or we're going to have x is equal to 7 minus root 129 all over 4. Now if I put those two things into my calculator, I'm going to get x is equal to, I'm going to get two answers, and I'm just going to go to my marking scheme for a minute. This is what my marking scheme looks like, just the B part here in the middle. So x is equal to 4.59. Let's go back here. X is equal to 4.59, or what did I say the other one was? Minus 1.09. Minus 1.09. So we've got our two answers. We've got them correct to two decimal places. If you notice my marking scheme there, it didn't give me marks the breakdown of the marks like my last question, which looked like this. But I'd imagine it'll be something similar. Getting your A's, getting your A, your B, your C, substituting in properly and tidying up correctly, and putting your answer in the right form. So guys, just to summarize everything we've done today, we looked at two exam questions and we looked at where to use your quadratic equation. Your key points are here. I'm going to copy and paste these into the description so that you can then copy and paste those onto a Word document or whatever notes that you're using. So just walk through them. Quadratic formula gets you the roots of your quadratic equation, and on a graph, that's going to be where your graph crosses the x-axis. It's used when your guide number method will not work. So let's say you get your guide number, you get your factors off your guide number, but they will not add together to give you your number in the middle of your quadratic. In that situation, your quadratic equation is perfect to use. In your exam question, one of the dead giveaways that you need to use your quadratic equation is it will say solve, so that means you need to get x at the end, and it will usually tell you your answer has a square root, so a plus or minus root b. That's their way of telling you there's a square root in your answer. Or to leave it to a certain number of decimal places. So if it says to leave it to 2 decimal places, you know that your answer is messy. You know that if it's a messy answer, chances are you might be able to get it with your guide number method. So just be careful of that. And then to use the quadratic formula, label A, B and C correctly. That's 5 out of your 10 marks, as we saw in the exam question. Make sure your substitution is immaculate. Substitute in. Be careful with your negative signs. Use your brackets. So if you're substituting in -2 for B, make sure you substitute in like that into your formula. Make sure to protect it with your brackets. Tidy up your equation. And remember to list your 2 answers at the end. Sometimes people, let's say going back to this one here, sometimes people will only put this one here. They'll forget about their second one here, and they'll end up losing a couple of marks because they forgot about the -1. So just be careful of that. My next video is going to be on surds, and I also have an indices one coming up, so they'll be coming up in the next couple of days, which does link into I had a situation on this question here, so the surds part. I will be doing a video on surds. I will be doing one on indices as well, so just keep an eye out for those and it'll shed some light on what we had a look at there. Alright, I think that's everything. If I've missed anything, I'll put it in the description. Okay, thanks for watching.